Okay, we finished the last piece of our conversation with that wonderful word, wisdom, and actually leveraging that wisdom.
Yeah.
How do you think you've used that wisdom in your life? I know that's a big question.
Just a bit. Sometimes not enough. I tend to be quite an impetuous person in making decisions, which is probably not a good thing. It ought to be more considered from time to time. But what it has given me throughout my working life is the ability to always look forward. Always if you get into a sticky situation, we're there. There's no point in crying over spilt milk. Let's now plan a way out of it. And I do that. I'm very quick to do that. And, whatever misfortune comes my way, I'm optimistic and I look forward, plan the way forward after that.
Have you wanted to do things like, you talked about the WI, and obviously you've given talks about your experience, but have you actually wanted to share that wisdom? Have you ever, for example, wanted to write a book or put it all down and kind of go, these are my life lessons and this is what I've learned?
Many, many people have said to me, you ought to write a book because, we've only touched on experiences I've had in life at the moment. And maybe I should, but frankly, I couldn't be bothered to. So
to sit down, it's a big.
I think it would, and I think it would be quite a big book at the end of it. And I don't know who would read it, apart from even my family probably wouldn't read it.
Okay, so let's just take that as a principle then, Chris, and let's step out into the world that you've been a part of, because you obviously grow from being a junior officer and you rise through the ranks.
Yeah.
Talk about that and actually how that happened and what actually happened. What is this kind of stepping stones that you go through?
The stepping stones are based on qualification. In the Merchant Navy, there are 3 certificates a navigating officer needs to get. You start off as a cadet with no qualification at all. You spend 4 years as a cadet, and then you go and sit for your second mate's certificate. The certificates are set by the Department of Trade and Industry. They're government certificates. And after 3 or 4 months at college, you pass your second mate's certificate, which are very onerous exams. They consist of 3 parts. There are 7 written papers, which you have to get 70% in all papers in order to pass it. There is a signals exam where you have to convince an examiner you're proficient in Morse, semaphore and flags. I think they probably dispense with that part nowadays. And then finally, there's the most daunting of all. There's an oral examination where you have to sit there in front of a crusty old master mariner for a 2-hour conversation and trying to convince him that as the master of the ship, he could sleep safe in his bed at night with me on the bridge of that ship. And if you get through all of that, you get your second mate certificate. You're generally then promoted to third officer, which means you're in charge of the 8 to 12 watch on a ship. So you're on the bridge from 8 to 12 in the morning and 8 to 12 in the evening. After a further 18 months at sea, you go back to college again and you sit your first mate's certificate. And it's the same rigmarole again, except slightly more advanced certificates and slightly greater subjects you have to do in that. Once you pass that one, you then get promoted to second officer, so that you're then generally promoted 1 rank below the certificate you've got. So you're qualified to do the job above you as well as doing your own. So when you've got a first mate certificate, you then get to be second mate. You spend another 2 or 3 years at sea, and then finally you go back and you take your master's certificate, which from first going to sea took me about 10 years before you finally get your master's certificate. And you haven't got to study anymore. You know everything, or the government says you know everything. You have bugger all in the way of wisdom, but you have the knowledge you now need to add to that experience, and then eventually you gain wisdom. Promotion then is dead man's shoes. You're just sitting there waiting for promotion. Once you've got your master's ticket, you'll generally get promoted to chief officer, and you'll sit being chief officer for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years in some cases before eventually you get to be called to command. And the command bit for me took 16 years from going to sea before eventually getting in command of a ship.
Pretty big responsibility, though, isn't it?
It's bigger than you think it's going to be. You spent your whole life, or 16 years of my life at sea as an officer, doing what I know I have to do, and doing it, I think, very well, and being very well regarded and very well thought of. But suddenly you get promoted to master after all those years of being used to being told what to do and when you're going to do it, and suddenly you're the person that's got to do the telling. And I can vividly remember to this day standing on the bridge of the ship in port of the first time I was in command, and everyone is standing around waiting for me to say something. And I'm used to somebody saying something to me to set the whole routine in motion. I know what the routine is. I know what needs to be done, but it's me that's got to say go. And suddenly you realise the enormity of it. There's no one you can ask. There's no one you can turn to. Everyone is turning to you.
I mean, my life experience feels very limited compared to that. For example, the only thing I can remember with real acuity is actually the first time I ever drove on my own in a car, having passed my driving test, and actually being in charge of a car out on my own without anybody there at all. The responsibility of taking command of a ship must feel of a whole different scale.
You fall back on your training, you fall back on your education, you fall back on your experiences watching other ship's masters in the past and what they've done. And I can remember that day that first experience, when I cast my mind back to all my experiences, suddenly I felt calm and I felt competent and I felt in control. And frankly, I never looked back after that, never thought about it again.
Okay, you just got on with doing what you had to do.
You just did it.
So tell me, because it's easy to paint quite a golden picture of going, oh, well, it was great and fantastic and so forth. Let me just take you back a little bit. You're doing your 8 to 12s for the first time. Yeah. Were there things that happened that stand out in your brain, particularly in those 8 to 12?
Yes, it's what the captain said to me. It's what the captain... I was appointed third officer on a 7,000 tons of oceanic splendour called the Rosalind Castle, which was the smallest ship we had in the fleet. She was not a passenger ship. She was a little ship that used to sail to South Africa and back and load up with fruit and bring it back to the UK. She was the oldest and dirtiest and nastiest little ship we had, but it's where they put officers on their first trip to sea. And you would generally, or their first trip as a certified officer. The second mate was on his first trip as second mate. The chief officer was on his first trip as chief officer. And the captain, I think, was probably only on his second voyage.
So you're all new
as
boys.
Captains. We were all just been promoted up. So we were all new on this lump of a ship. And I joined it in South Shields Dry Dock. And we were sailing straight to South Africa to load up with fruit. And we set sail from the Tyne. It was February 1967. And we set sail from the Tyne, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 8 o'clock, I made my way to the bridge, and it was dark, and it was cold, and it was wet, and we were sailing out across the North Sea, and in quite busy traffic routes there. There's plenty of fishing boats around and other ships sailing up and down, so it can be quite busy. And navigation, you have to be on your toes there. Anyway, I get up to the bridge, and the chief officer is there, who I'm taking over from. He was on the 4 to 8. Is there, and I relieve him, and he goes down below, and the captain comes up on the bridge, and he says, this is Mr. Isaac. He said, this is your first voyage as a watchkeeping officer, isn't it? And it was a fact I was only too well aware of, and I said, yes, sir, it is. He said, call me if you need me. And he made his way below. And I was eternally grateful to that man for placing his trust in me in saying, I'm going below to my cabin. And I'm sure he spent the next 4 hours with his head hanging out of the window of his cabin, making sure that we were safe and sound. But nonetheless, I felt that he trusted me. And that was a captain. I had actually sailed with him before on one of those Bellwater ships going across the North Atlantic. And I subsequently sailed him on a few ships afterwards, right up until the time he became Commodore of the company. And he still had me as his navigating officer on board our biggest ship, which was Windsor Castle, many years later. But it was that initial trust he placed in me that I was forever grateful for.
I'm trying to reconcile two things. The kind of totemic moments that you went through, and they were extraordinary kind of moments, and the memories that you have with those. And I'm trying to balance that against what was happening, because you are now, you're married, you've got a family, you've got kids who are growing up, and you are also living this life where you're away for long periods of time and coming back. Sometimes that balance is really hard to manage, isn't it?
I wasn't married while I was at sea.
Weren't you?
No.
Okay.
I was a single man.
Okay.
And thank heaven for that, because after a while you get to sail on passenger ships.
You didn't have all that responsibility then?
No, not at all. No.
Okay.
And sailing on passenger ships, the last thing you need is a wife.
Okay. So you actually do that particular trip, and it obviously stands out in your memory, and he moved on to become the Commodore. So there must have been,
eventually, after a period
there
of
must have
time,
been some recognition of that leadership capability and so forth. What if you look back, and let's learn some lessons from it, if you look back at him as a person, what was it that he did besides placing trust in you? What else was it about his leadership that stands out for you?
His name was Captain Harold Charnley, known throughout the fleet as Chuckles Charnley, because many captains back in those days had been very scarred by their experiences during the war, and some of them tended to be either a bit too much to drink, a bit morose, but in any event wouldn't talk about those experiences, and I wish they had, because I would like to have learnt about them. But Chuckles Charnley was not one of those. He was not a great drinker. He was a very social man. He enjoyed golf, as did I, which is why we subsequently became friends as well as seafarers together. And although he was authoritarian and he was very strict and he was very meticulous in what he did it all with a charm and a smile on his face and with a sense of humour. And you could relate to someone like that. And although you obeyed what he said to the letter, you knew that after you'd done that little thing and after things had calmed down and were a bit relaxed, you could have a joke with him. He was human.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he allowed you to get to his humanity.
Yeah,
and
very
that
much.
accessibility to that humanity becomes very important in terms of leaders, doesn't it? I found in my work, actually, around the world with all sorts of leaders in all sorts of situations, that it can be a very lonely position to be in. It can be quite an isolating position. And actually having mates or friends kind of seems to disappear. And sometimes, as you rightly say, some of them become dependent. They drink too much, and they actually drink too much, or they're actually showing all the signs of suffering from isolation and depression. But we never step in. We never ever did in those days.
Something I've found now, I mean, I still look back on my seagoing days with huge fondness, and I do actually have a website that I run and have run for about the last 15 years, which records the history of that shipping company and all the people who said, not all the people, as many people as I can get the histories from, having little potted biographies of those people there, particularly the ship's captains. And the strange thing that I have found, the vast majority of them, when they got to about 62, 63, they retired. And I look at their photographs on the website, they all look like old men at 62, 63, and they're all generally dead by the time they were 66, 67. Once they left the sea, the majority of them passed away fairly quickly. They'd lost their interest in life.
So their purpose seemed to have gone.
Yeah, totally.
Do you think, actually, that now there are a lot of people who've done jobs of all sorts of responsibility who lose that purpose?
I think as a race, we retire far too early. I mean, I'm in a couple of months' time, I'm 80, but I have no plans to retire whatsoever. I can't think of anything worse than just sitting at home and letting your wife find you things to do, and secondly, just vegetating and letting your mind vegetate.
Do you find other people, your friendship groups or whatever, do you think they think you're strange because of that?
No, not really.
Okay.
No.
You mean wanting to work is become part of who you are?
I think they are, and I think if I look back at the people I know best now, and I'm still friends with the most, They're still active. They're still busy. They tend to be all old seafarers as well, because we share something, some bond or whatever it is. Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting. I mean, it's interesting because this idea of not wanting to retire, I mean, I have conversations with people and people look at me as though there's something wrong with me because I have no wish to retire at all. And I have to say, with some deference to you, I'm not quite as old as you, only by a little bit, but I'm not quite as old as you. But I have no wish to retire at all. And in fact, I find work and the engagement and the involvement with other people, I find it totally, utterly absorbing.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually being able sometimes to bring wisdom to certain situations helps, but sometimes it can also hinder, but it helps those sort of situations with other people. And I think culturally, and I'm sure, I don't know, your travels, which have been much more extensive than mine, if you look in terms of cultures, the Chinese have a great way of respecting wisdom. They don't view old age as a detriment at all. They regard it as wisdom.
Yeah.
The people, the wise people, are the older people, and that generation are spoken to and listened to in a completely different way than our culture. I think what has happened is the divisions between young and old and life experience have become huge, and we don't respect and don't recognise. And I don't think we mobilise or utilise some of those talents that there are. I mean, I live in a community which is full of people who've had an extraordinary, rich life experience, but I'm not sure that we actually bring those life experiences out into the open and share them with the rest of the community to the benefit of the community. There are people who've done all sorts of stuff.
I think because the world has changed so dramatically in the last 10 years for people now. I mean, my children are 32 now, but they've grown up in this new age, if you like, which is totally driven by technology. They can find out anything they want to know by just picking up their phone and typing into Google or whatever, and gain some knowledge about what it is they're trying to find out about. They don't think they need to call upon people like me. In fact, if I start talking to them about old stuff, you can see their eyes roll up, and and I sympathise with them to a great extent, because what use are they going to make of that knowledge? What I knew and the experiences I knew and the jobs that I did just don't exist anymore.
You don't think they've got any relevance then?
No.
At all in this modern era?
Not a lot.
I wouldn't agree with you. I think actually I wouldn't agree with you, simply because you cannot stop that life experience. It formulates who you are and how you are and what you do as a person. And sometimes you naturally, default to behaving in a particular way because that's your life experience. That's what you do. And what you find strange, or I certainly find strange, is a dissonance between why don't people know that? Why don't people see that? Why don't people do that? And that's because they've never had that as a life experience or never ever been shown what to do. So those skills of sociability, getting on with other people, learning how to live with other people, developing tolerance and being patient are all the kind of things that you have to learn in those processes.
But young people today have all, and I'm not knocking young people today, but it's the education system. We now have the national curriculum. Every single child comes out of school having learnt exactly the same thing as every other child. But they've gained no wisdom. They haven't gone out in the big wide world. People don't leave school at 16 and go out and do stuff. They go to university for good. Everyone now goes to university. Whereas in my day, very few people ever went to university.
Because they couldn't afford to.
They couldn't afford to, and they weren't the universities. Universities now are just, they're an industry. It's an industry. They're just there to snaffle up student loans from people and put people in debt for the next 30-odd years.
We could paint the picture as a black picture because whether you like it or not, you were also part of an industry whereby it was exploitative, it was in a way like slave labour, or very talented and very capable young men doing jobs, hard work and so forth and whatever. Because if you look at those early and formative years, you really had to do the hard yards in order to climb that ladder. There were no shortcuts to be taken.
No, not at all.
Right, and if you were given a job to do and you went, oh, this is really boring, people go, tough, just get on with it.
Yeah.
Right, there was little patience or tolerance for people who didn't want to do certain things. and you learned very much the kind of hard way, because there was a hard way as well that went with it.
There was a lot of boring tasks at sea. I mean, if you're going across a big ocean and you're taking 2 weeks to do it, believe me, there's a lot of boredom involved in that. I tend to look back on it through rose-coloured spectacles and I see all the glamorous side of it, but I tend to gloss over the hours and hours and hours of monotony standing on the bridge of a ship at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's absolutely bugger all out there to look at, and the ship's just ploughing through the water.
Oh, okay. I was just thinking about that myself. It's a bit, you're on cruise control in the middle of an ocean, but I'm not using it as a kind of joke, cruise control, but you're out there and you're effectively on cruise control.
Yeah.
And also the tragedies there have been of people who've fallen asleep on watches and so forth, simply because it is so boring.
Yeah, yeah.
I can imagine the monotony, the drum, the noise, the continuity and the continuousness of, we've got to do that, have we? We've got to do that again, and this is going on, and this is what's happening. And it really becomes a huge, huge challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, do you think you and I, as a sort of couple of old codgers, are sitting here and actually all we're doing is reinforcing and demonstrating the distance between what was and what is now and what the reality is? And how do we build those bridges? What do we need to do?
I mean, yes, we are reinforcing it. How do we build a bridge between one and the other? I do sometimes wonder, does a bridge need to be built there? Because I think people have now, we sailed on a different ship, to strain the metaphor, back in those days. The ship now is very different. It's based around technology, artificial intelligence, all that sort of stuff. Does it need our stuff anymore? I don't know.
That wisdom, you're seeing those wisdom workers don't have a place within that model of the new world that we're now a part of.
I think people will be interested in it. I think we are, I do speak from time to time, sort of after dinner speeches and things like that, talking about my seagoing experiences, and people lap that up with a spoon. But do they lap it up because they want to be entertained, or they're actually seeking an increase in their knowledge? I think it's the former.
You mean the entertainment that goes with it? Well, you must present it in a way which engages them and involves them in a very, very different kind of way. Because if we go back to the very beginning of our conversation, it's unleashing that kind of romance. It's about not recognizing. You talked about having been at sea for 20 years, right? The hard work and the boredom and the things that you had to do, which were part of the ingredients of being at sea for 20 years. It wasn't all romance. It wasn't all excitement. It wasn't all about involvement. There were a lot of quite kind of tense and dramatic moments. So if you troll back through your brain, think back through all those kind of things, what were the biggest dramas that you came across during that period of time?
Well, that's quite an easy one to answer. A few years ago, I applied to go on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And one of the questions you were asked before you went for an audition was just the same as you've just asked. What's the most interesting thing that's happened in your life that you could talk to Chris Tarrant about if you're lucky enough to get in the chair? And I told them something that had happened to me. Anyway, 10 minutes after they'd had the initial phone call, they phoned me up and they said, "Really, did this happen to you?" And I said, "Yes, it did." And they said, "Would you come for an audition?" I said, "Yes, I will." So I went along to the audition, and eventually I got in the chair. I won the fastest finger first. I got in the chair on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and I sat opposite Chris Tarrant, and he never once brought up the subject of what I'd been asked about. And one of my claims to fame, if you like, is I once spent 5 weeks of my life shipwrecked on a desert island. Now, not too many people that's happened to, but I was on a ship going to Australia in 1965. The ship was called Ayrshire, and we had just left Aden, we were going to Cochin in southern India because we were changing crew. The ship had Indian crew, and then we were going on to Australia. And it was March 23rd, 1965, beautiful sunny afternoon, and we were sailing past an island just off the Horn of Africa. Little island was called Abd el Kuri, which is an island that's only 5 miles long and 1 mile wide. It's inhabited but not civilized. And the captain of the ship had taken a along the south coast of the island, quite close in to show the passengers on the ship. And all of a sudden, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the bow of the ship suddenly shot up in the air, a huge crunch, and we'd hit an uncharted rock, and half the bottom of the ship was ripped out, and we went straight over the rock, and the ship was standing on the bridge of the ship. We could see that the water was getting closer as we were standing there, so the ship was clearly sinking. And we sent 3 of the 4 lifeboats away with the passengers and most of the crew in, and 6 of us were left on board. The captain by now was obviously on the bridge of the ship, and fortunately myself and the chief officer who had been on the bridge at the time had seen a little sandy bay on the island. The rest of the island was just sheer cliffs coming out of the sea, and without that little sandy bay we would have sunk. And the captain said, right, we'll turn around and we'll head for that bay. And fortunately the engine room hadn't been holed and we still had power on the ship. And we turned the ship aground, and the captain, by this time I was still a cadet, but he'd put me on the wheel of the ship, and he said, just head for that bay. And so me heading for the ship straight for the bay, and we ran the ship straight up the beach to stop her sinking. And we've spent 5 weeks aground on that island trying to get her off. And eventually the monsoon season came along, and the ship started bouncing up and down. She was starting to crack apart. And so the salvage tugs that were with us at that time took us back to Aden, and we flew home, and the ship was just left there to its own fate, and eventually just would have broken apart and just be just littered on the seafloor now.
So at a practical level, you'd just been shipwrecked by running into an uncharted rock. Okay. But at an emotional level, what was that like?
Oh, it was nobody was hurt. Nobody was injured in this thing. It was a beautifully sunny day. It was an adventure. We'd never any time actually felt any real danger. The ship we weren't in a rough sea. The ship wasn't sort of flopping from side to side, which it could well have been with the amount of water that was now in the ship's holds. It was just sinking bodily there. So the sooner we could get her aground, and it only took us about an hour from hitting the rock to actually getting her on the beach, and to comparative safety. And everyone then came back on board, and we had most normal services. The engine room wasn't flooded, so we still had power, and we had electricity, and we had food,
so
and we
passengers, how many passengers were
12 passengers.
12. Okay.
And we had limitless supplies of beer, and which were replenished regularly by the various ships passing by.
What were you carrying?
Oh, anything you think of, anything that Britain makes, we were carrying it. So there were carpets, there were cars, there were bricks, there was chemicals, there was Macefield's poem all about the old tin tea trays and things like that. Everything, all general cargo bound for Australia. Once we got to Australia, we were going to be loading fruit to come back because the ship was refrigerated. But we never got to Australia. And I have still never got to Australia.
Really?
No.
Okay, so that was on your trip to Australia, and then you flew back from there. Okay.
We flew back from Aden, yeah.
Okay. And was that reported nationally or internationally, or?
It was reported a bit. If you knew where to look, it was on shipping journals. Okay. But because there was no loss of life, then it didn't get widely reported, no.
Okay. But it attracted enough to get you onto Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Oh, yes, it got me onto that, and it's got me onto a few other things in my time.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you view it with some sort of romance in a way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
A boy's own adventure.
Absolutely. And I've told the story countless times. In fact, to my children far too many times over the years. But in the years since it happened, and this is now 61 years ago that it happened, and stories tend to get embellished a little over the years. And I really have to check myself sometimes to try and remember how much of the story really happened and how much I've added to over the years.
Okay, all right.
But the guts of it are true.
Okay. So tell me about Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
I've always had a very good general knowledge. So I've always fancied going on television and doing that. And actually before I went...
So can I ask before you even start, why?
Oh, life's experiences, travelling abroad. Seeing stuff that you don't get to see.
Why did you want to be on television?
Oh, it was a television program, I think, in those days. This is back early 2000s, which had just captured the imagination of the British public. We'd never seen a quiz show like it, where you could go on television, you could potentially win £1 million.
Okay. So talk me through what actually happened.
Well, I had some experience before, because I'd been on The Weakest Link before that with Anne Robinson, and I'd won that. And I'd got through that show without getting a question wrong. And only 2 people have ever done that. Me and one of the eggheads did it. And so I thought, I'll have a crack at Millionaire. And so I got into the ring of 12 people there, and I was always praying when we got to a fastest finger first bit that we get a really difficult question that involved geography, and that exactly what I got was a difficult question about religions in various parts of the world, and according to where they are from east to west, put them in A, B, C, D in that order. And I got it in very quickly, and I thought, right, I'm certain to get in the chair with that one. And I did. So.
Okay, so you didn't suffer the viciousness of the tongue of Anne Robinson then?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Despite the fact you survived?
Absolutely. I got, yes, she sort of gave me full blast what she thought of people. But she, at the same time, she was on my side a bit going through it. Because I remember one time she turned to me and she said, and it was about sort of round 5, a few people had been eliminated, and she said, Chris, she said, how do you think you're doing? And I said, I'm doing all right, Anne. And she said, do you think there's room for improvement? And I said, well, you of all people should know about having room for improvement in people's lives, because I know she had a slightly checkered past, and you were encouraged before the show to give it to her as good as she gives to you, because she laps it up with a spoon. And she said, are you aware that you haven't got a question wrong yet? And I said, I was aware of that, Anne, but I was really rather hoping you wouldn't bring it to the attention of everybody else, because they might vote me off. From then on, she was on my side, and she really emphasised to people that they should vote off the weakest link at the end of each round and not pick on me. And throughout the entire show, not one person voted for me. I got right through to the final and then won it. And you don't win a huge amount of money on there. You win a degree of smugness and a small cheque at the end of it.
Okay, can I ask you, do your peers or your friends or associates or so forth balance 2 bits? And if I reflect back on our conversation, you actually started by telling me when you were at school that you were very bright, and now you're telling me that you actually managed to get through and you didn't get a question wrong. Do you think that kind of behaviour irritates other people sometimes?
Yeah, I guess it probably does. I think but mainly family members.
Okay. So how do you live with that then, Chris? What do you do? Do you apologise for it?
It's up to them to live with it.
You just tell them.
They have to live with it. It's them's got to live with it, not me.
Okay.
If I agreed with everything that they said, then we'd both be wrong.
Okay. So as a dad, your kids look at you and go, oh yeah, he thinks he knows everything, and he does know everything.
I think all kids think that about their fathers. But I think now they've got to 30. I know one of the children has said this to me. We now think, or I now think, one of them said it. We said, you actually were right, looking back on it. Yeah. While they were teenagers, they knew everything. But they get to realise once they get to their late 20s, early 30s, that maybe Dad did know.
Okay, so where does that come from? I mean, I know you said it to me about school and you found it quite easy. That acquisition or that hoovering up of know-how, knowledge, facts and so forth. Where does that come from? How do you actually acquire that? Is it because you were born with a great brain or because of your life experience?
I think I was born with a good brain. Both my parents were highly intelligent. My natural parents were highly intelligent. I can always remember the sort of books that I read as a child. I found the most fascination with, particularly atlases. I would look at atlases day in, day out. They just held great fascination for me, which I think led me to wanting to go to sea. Any books to do with exploration or travel, true stories. I wasn't so much interested in fictional writing. I wanted accounts of explorers.
Do?
Sorry?
What did your dad do job-wise?
my natural father was a child psychologist.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was a highly intelligent man. I mean, even he was on BBC Brains Trust and things like that. He was a very brilliant man. He was a very good man at knowing how to deal with other people's children, but not very good with dealing with his own.
Okay. So in terms of, so you grew up in a wisdom atmosphere. You grew up in an atmosphere surrounded by wisdom, and actually take it as a natural occurrence anyway and think, oh, okay, well, that's what actually happens. So you were saying earlier, and we're talking about your own kids, that they now reflect, and now because they're 30 or so forth, they look back on their life and they go, oh, yes, you were right. Did you try and consciously try and create that wisdom atmosphere amongst your kids in terms of growing up?
No. And I don't think I could have done or would have known how to have done that. But I do think that I think of particularly the two children that are now in a service environment, Royal Air Force or the police. With them, I've been able to give them a great deal more encouragement than any other form of profession, because I know they're going into an environment, and I used the term shipmates earlier on. They're going into a very closed environment, whether or not it's working on an aircraft together. It's being in a very close-knit team community where they will have to work together with other people, be they subordinate or be they superior to them. They will have to cooperate, those people, as well as giving orders, as well as obeying those people. They will have to get on with them as well. And I think I've passed that on to them, and certainly encouraged them along those lines, because I knew they would value it and they would thrive in that environment.
I mean, I think it's quite interesting because you've never been to Australia, but both my kids are in Australia. And one of the phrases that they use in Australia is mateship, is about having mates.
Yeah,
and they actually
absolutely.
refer to people, mate, and it irritates the hell out of me. But they refer to you as a mate when I kind of go, no, you're not my mate.
Yeah.
And you haven't earned that right to be my mate, because being a mate is a very earned title.
Yes.
And you understand that, and you recognise that. But you understand and recognise what it actually happened. Are there things to learn? Are there things to learn from what is a closed environment in which people grow up constrained by roles and responsibilities and process and procedures? Are there things to learn in terms of taking those into life experiences?
Yes. That you could be mates, you can be workmates, you can be shipmates, you can be whatever mates. You might not like them at all, but you can still be mates and go towards a goal together.
Okay. Is that how do you get over those things? How do you get over when it's a big jump for people to imagine in certain relationships with people that you don't like, thinking by your kind of edict you have to get on and you have to learn how to like those people. You have to learn how you can actually do those things and how they can actually like those.
You find an area of common ground. I know in the confines of a ship, there was always some people. I mean, I by and large got on with everybody on the ship, but there would be one person, you didn't like them and they didn't like you. It didn't ever come to blows or anything like that, but you just didn't get on with them. They weren't your cup of tea, if you like. But what you had in common was you were doing the same job or a complementary job to each other. And you may confine your conversation just to professional conversation rather than having a social conversation. And there was plenty of other people to go and talk to if you wanted to talk to people socially. You didn't let it rule your life, those conflicts.
Did you have rows or arguments with other people ever?
Don't remember any at sea.
Okay.
Don't remember a row. No, I don't. And I've never been asked that question before, but I don't ever remember having a real...
So you've never fallen out with other people?
No, maybe not like them and didn't mix socially with them, but I'd never had a row with them.
So what are the cues that you're looking for? So you meet somebody and you kind of meet them and then you go, actually, I don't like you. I don't like what it is that you stand for. Is it something they say? Is it something they do? Is it something they behave? What are the cues to you which actually mean that trigger goes off? Because if you've made that decision, Chris, then you won't associate with them at all, will you? If you could, or you'll avoid them if you possibly can.
I think just speaking purely personally, occasionally I am occasionally. I'm quite often intolerant of people, and I often keep it to myself. I often don't as well. But things I'm intolerant of, we spoke about in the first chapter of this, was people who are doing something in a sloppy fashion. People who I don't like drunkenness particularly. It's just people who are not doing something in the way that I would have done it. And although I may be intolerant of it, often I will just close my mind to it, and I'll just treat them professionally rather than treat them socially.
So you shut up and don't say anything?
Yeah, generally.
You're just going to get on with
Sometimes
it.
I don't.
It was interesting yesterday. I actually went on the bus from Exmouth to Exeter. And when we were sat on the bus, and the first bus had been cancelled, so I was kind of mildly irritated because I'd sat at the bus stop for over 30 minutes. Anyway, the next bus turned up, and when it arrived, the bus driver loaded everybody on the bus, and then he proceeded to jump out of the bus and run to the front of the bus and not smoke, but I would use the word consume a cigarette. I've never seen anybody trying to smoke faster in my life.
Yeah.
So he has a cigarette. And I thought, oh, okay, so I can cope with that. And then we drove into Exeter, and we pull up outside the RD&E, and he gets out of his bus again and runs around the front of his bus and consumes another cigarette.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, I found it incredibly irritating. That I thought it was ironic that he was stood outside the RD&E, right, as a hospital, there consuming this cigarette. And I thought, well, you're going to be a patient pretty soon if you keep that going.
Well, yeah, he knows where it is now.
Okay, but you learn to be tolerant of those things. I mean, there are lots and lots of little things can trigger us in all sorts of ways. And in terms of that tolerance, so let's go back a little bit to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we're going to have a little break now, and then we'll come back. Okay?
Okay.
All right?